Good evening, friends. Early on in the pandemic, I did one spiritual reflection on grief. Today, I want to revisit that subject. If you're like me, your griefs, your sadness, your feelings of being blue and depressed, isolated and lonely, have only increased as the months have extended beyond what we had hoped. First, let's be very clear that grief is not just caused by the death of a loved one. That is often what we think of most when someone uses the word grief. We do most often think of grief as the death of a person or a pet. However, grief occurs with any significant change or loss in our lives. Over the past several months, millions in our nation alone have suffered the death of loved ones. That is probably what causes the most intense grief reactions in the lives of humans. However, loss of a job, loss of one's business, a broken relationship, as in divorce or family friction, loss of your normal routine, difficulty in grocery shopping and other everyday tasks, changes in your work schedule and your children or grandchildren's school schedules, the loss of your plans and dreams, all these and more have caused us grief. We have experienced changes in most every aspect of our lives. We might mention that we are saddened by many other things within our nation and around the world: hunger, homelessness, illness, injustice, lying and subsequent loss of trust on many levels, political disagreements, even among family and friends, and so much more. We are grieving. Grief occurs with any major change in one's life. The word mourning refers to outward expressions of grief. For instance, rituals like funerals and memorial services, which have also changed this past year, journaling, talk therapy, creating a video or a photo album or a memory box about a person who died, are some examples of our mourning. They are ways of getting some of our grief from inside our hearts and minds and bodies to the outside of us. Mourning helps our grieving process. Some might advise you that time is the cure for grief. Time alone is not, but time spent processing our grief, experiencing the depth of our authentic and varied feelings, help us to heal, though we will always be scarred. Today I want to briefly go over some of the highlights of common or normal grief reactions. Don't think you're going crazy. Next week, I intend to talk about what to do with our grief, how to do our grief work. Before I review common dimensions of normal grief, I want to remind us all that at any one time we can be in very different places with our grief related to different changes or losses or deaths. No wonder many of us are quite the jumble of feelings. I give credit to Alan Wolfelt, my favorite grief expert, for the common dimensions of normal grief that I share with you now. Nature's way of temporarily protecting us from the reality of the death often leads us to experience shock, denial, numbness, disbelief. We may experience heart palpitations, queasiness, stomach pain, dizziness. We may have hysterical crying, outburst of anger, laughing, even fainting. And expressing those kinds of behaviors allow you to survive. We may also have what we call the going crazy syndrome, a sense of restlessness, agitation, impatience, confusion. Some people have visual hallucinations, difficulty eating or sleeping, dreams about the deceased. This is often the most isolating and frightening part of our grief, when we feel disorganized, confused, yearning, and searching. Our bodies also respond to what our mind has been told at the time of intense grief. There's often a lack of energy, a shortness of breath, sensitivity to noise, headaches, and then some of those other symptoms mentioned above. Difficulty eating, sleeping, confusion, hysterical crying, anger, heart palpitations, stomach pain, dizziness, queasiness. So our bodies also react to our emotions. Our emotions are sometimes explosive. At times that may be an overwhelming feeling of sadness, and we may just cry for what we feel is no reason. Another explosive emotion in many people is anger. We may feel hate, blame, resentment, jealousy. And beneath those feelings are often the feelings of pain and helplessness, fear and hurt. They are often because we want things to be the way they were before the death. So it's important to feel what we feel. Another aspect is guilt and regret. So often in our grief, we'll think of finishing these sentences. I wish I had, I wish I hadn't, I should have, I shouldn't have, I wish I'd said this, I wish I'd done that, I wish I hadn't said this. So guilt and regret are a common experience. Sometimes it's about the circumstances surrounding the death. Sometimes it's about unfinished business in the relationship. Probably the most common dimension of grief is that of loss and emptiness and sadness. Typically, that's what we would think of as a grief reaction, but oh, it's so much more. It may take quite a while, several months, before the full force of that loss is felt. There comes a time when you realize things have changed and they're not going to change back to the way they were before. Sometimes the most difficult times are weekends, holidays, first waking up in the morning, late at night, or meal times. Another emotion that we often are reluctant to express are the feelings of relief and release. Relief from suffering is very real, and those feelings are sometimes hard for the one who's grieving to talk about, because feeling relief, we often blame ourselves and then feel guilty because we think we shouldn't feel relief. And yet relief is natural because it frees one of suffering, pain, and opens up new opportunities and experiences. And ultimately, the goal, and what does happen, is some sense of reconciliation. We are changed by our experiences of grief. And in time, we are able to rearrange the pieces of our lives back into some type of a whole, even though it is very different from before. I hope that in hearing these common dimensions of normal grief, you will recognize that many of the things that most of us are feeling these days are very common because we are grieving. Be mindful, please, that the loss of a loved one typically takes a year at a minimum for one to begin to feel sort of back to normal, to feel like they can hope or begin to think of planning for the future again. If the death is unexpected, if it was suicide or homicide, if it was complicated for some other reasons, it may take a minimum of 2 years or more to begin to feel that you sort of put your life back together. So now in this next week, as you experience life, think about losses you've experienced in recent months. Of course, deaths of loved ones, which are of utmost importance, but other losses as well. And in doing that, be gentle with yourself. Give yourself grace to feel whatever you feel and to do what you need to do in your grief. And let us who are believers in Christ remember and remind others, as St. Paul did, that though we grieve, we do not grieve as those who have no hope, for we do believe in the resurrection. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.